The Japanese pilots first saw the P-38 Lightning as a curiosity rather than a threat. A strange twin-boom machine that looked too heavy, too stiff, too American to survive in the swirling dogfights above New Guinea. Zero pilots joked over their radios that the Lightning fell like a stone in a turn and climbed like a wounded buffalo. And in those early months of 1943, they weren't entirely wrong. The first USAAF pilots flying out of WWII and Port Moresby were still learning the aircraft's temperament, its weight, its compressibility issues in high-speed dives, its reluctance to turn tightly at low altitudes. In close-quarters combat, the A6M0 could carve circles around a Lightning. But the Japanese pilots misread the machine. What they took as a weakness was only the outer layer of an aircraft built for a completely different kind of war. The P-38 was not designed to fight the Zero's fight. It was built for speed, altitude, and energy. Massive, crushing, bone-shaking energy that the Zero could never match. And in the skies of New Guinea, where visibility stretched for miles and engagements often began as specks glinting in the sun, the Lightning was slowly awakening to its true role. Yet, in early 1943, the Japanese still laughed. Reports from the Tainan Air Group described the Lightning as slow to respond and incapable of pursuit. Zero pilots routinely tried to bait American flyers into turn fights, and many young USAAF pilots took the bait, losing altitude and advantage until the nimble Zero slipped onto their tail. Losses were painful, the lessons harsh. But among the surviving P-38 pilots, men like Charles Lindbergh Jr., Tommy Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron, and veterans of the 80th FS, an understanding began to take hold. Every time the Lightning escaped by diving away, something remarkable happened. The Zero didn't follow. In every encounter, the same pattern emerged. The P-38 would tip its nose down, engines howling, props screaming into a silver blur, and the airspeed indicator would climb, 300 miles per hour, 350, 400, sometimes even pushing beyond 480 miles per hour as the Lightning carved a smooth, perfect arc toward the sea. And the Zero simply could not match it. Its lightweight frame began to shake past 350 miles per hour. Control surfaces stiffened. Wings risked shearing off in high-speed dives. Japanese pilots reported feeling their aircraft lock up if they tried to pursue. Slowly, realization spread in the USAAF ranks. The P-38's dive was not just fast, it was a weapon no Japanese aircraft could follow. By March 1943, combat reports circulated through the 5th Air Force describing this advantage. One stated simply, "Zero cannot pursue Lightning in dive. Lightning must initiate combat from altitude." Another recorded an incident near Buna where a P-38, cornered by two Zeros, escaped by pointing its nose down and accelerating beyond enemy capability. USAAF tactical bulletin drafts, later finalized in mid-1943, began emphasizing a new mantra: never turn with a Zero. Fight with altitude, fight with speed. Pilots practiced keeping their aircraft above 20,000 feet, using the early sun to mask their approach, and diving only when the moment was perfect. Yet in early 1943, this was still a theory, a tactic being born. The Japanese continued to underestimate the aircraft, never imagining the Lightning would soon master the very maneuver they mocked, the high-speed dive, transforming it from a desperate escape trick into the deadliest form of attack in the Pacific. The Zero pilots didn't know it yet, but the days when they could swoop confidently onto American formations were ending. Above the steaming jungles of New Guinea, the twin-engine fighter they ridiculed was learning to strike from the sun, fall like a hammer, fire a single devastating burst from its nose guns, and climb away untouched. Boom and zoom was coming, and it would change everything. By mid-1943, the pilots of the 5th Air Force were done learning the hard way. They buried too many friends, watched too many Lightnings spiral into the jungle in flames because someone tried to outturn a Zero. In the ready rooms at WWII, Nadzab, and Port Moresby, veteran pilots began speaking with new conviction. The P-38 wasn't meant to dance, it was meant to strike. Men like Major Richard Bong, Thomas McGuire, Charles McDonald, J. Robbins, and the instructors of the 8th and 49th Fighter Groups gathered their rookies and drilled a new doctrine into them with almost religious intensity. Never turn, never bleed speed, never fight the Zero's fight. The Lightning is an energy machine, so fight like one. It wasn't swagger, it was experience, honed through blood. After dozens of engagements, the veterans understood what the Japanese didn't. The P-38 possessed the single greatest tactical advantage of any fighter in the Southwest Pacific: the ability to dive past 480 miles per hour, 770 to 800 kilometers per hour, without breaking apart, without losing control, and without losing the fight. The Zero couldn't touch that. The Zero couldn't even attempt it. Its wings shook, its frame buckled, its controls froze. Japanese pilots knew this. They wrote it in their own combat diaries. The Lightning dives like a stone, but it escapes like wind. Do not follow. You will die. And yet, they still mock the tactic, calling it cowardly, unmanly, unworthy of a fighter pilot. For the Americans, honor didn't matter. Surviving the mission mattered. Winning mattered. Boom and Zoom began as improvisation, but evolved into doctrine. USAF Tactical Bulletin 1943 finally codified the rule: maintain altitude advantage, use diving speed to initiate slashing attacks, do not attempt turning engagement with A6M or K-43 types. Pilots practiced high-altitude positioning like artillerymen adjusting fire. They orbited at 22,000 to 25,000 feet, engines humming, studying the Japanese formations below. Bong described it perfectly. We owned the top floor. From there, you choose when to fight, how to fight, and when to leave. And the Japanese had no answer. In one training run, a squadron from the 39th Fighter Squadron simulated a coordinated dive attack from 23,000 feet. The P-38s accelerated so violently that several young pilots later said the aircraft felt alive, shuddering as air screamed across the twin booms. When they leveled out, the nose-mounted .50 cals and 20mm cannon delivered a punch so concentrated that a 1-second burst shredded the plywood targets as if a grenade had detonated inside each of them. But training was just preparation. The real proof came in the skies of New Guinea. On 11 July 1943, near Solomioa, a patrol of 8 P-38s from the 39th FS spotted a formation of Zeros at lower altitude. The Zeros dove toward them with their usual confidence, expecting the Americans to turn and fight. Instead, the Lightnings climbed. Even by a few hundred feet, it was enough. Then, the world flipped. The P-38s rolled over and dove, 8 streaks of silver fire falling from the sun. Airspeed indicators climbed past 400 miles per hour, then 450. The Japanese pilots didn't react quickly enough. They tried to turn, scattering in panic, but their aircraft simply couldn't match the Americans' velocity. The first American dive shattered their formation. 2 Zeros exploded almost instantly under concentrated burst from the nose guns. Another had its tail ripped off. Another fell in spiraling smoke, wings shredded. By the time the P-38s leveled out and climbed away, they had destroyed 5 enemy fighters without losing a single aircraft. The Japanese pilots, stunned, didn't pursue. They couldn't pursue. From that day, something changed. Reports across 5th Air Force began to sound different, less cautious, more confident. Pilots wrote things like, "We hit them before they knew we were there. They never saw us coming. They broke formation the moment we dove." Yet even this was just the beginning. The P-38's transformation wasn't only tactical, it was cultural. Rookie pilots began to imitate the veterans, speaking of altitude as money in the bank, of diving speed as the hammer, and of climbing reacceleration as the shield. They learned that a P-38 with energy was untouchable. They learned to choose when to attack instead of reacting. They learned that patience, not aggression, won battles. One young pilot, after months of frustration, finally understood during a mission near Leh. He kept his Lightning above the fight, resisting the urge to dive too soon. When he finally chose his moment, he struck once, 1 burst, 1 kill, and climbed away untouched. In his journal that night he wrote, "Now I get it. The dive is everything. They cannot follow. They cannot fight speed." Meanwhile, the Japanese remained trapped in their doctrine of close-in maneuvering combat. Even their most experienced aces misjudged the Lightning's capabilities. Many believed the P-38 would rip its wings off at high speed or go uncontrollable in compressibility. That was true at 30,000 feet. But the Americans quickly learned to dive slightly shallower, initiating recovery earlier. By summer 1943, the Lightning pilots could ride the edge of compressibility without crossing it. The Japanese never adapted. They never redesigned the Zero structure. They never retrained pilots to fight in the vertical. They fought the war they wished they were in, not the war they were in, and the P-38 exploited it mercilessly. By late August 1943, a 5th Air Force intelligence summary noted, "Enemy fighter units now attempt to avoid engagement with P-38s when altitude disadvantage exists." In other words, they were afraid of the dive. And they were right to be. because the next phase, the WWII strikes, would prove what happened when boom and zoom wasn't just a tactic, but a weapon of mass destruction in the sky. The strike on WWII began before sunrise, when the sky over New Guinea was still a deep indigo and the jungle below lay wrapped in mist. The Japanese considered WWII their strongest remaining air fortress in the region: 4 airfields, dozens of revetments, hundreds of aircraft, and veterans of the Tainan, 204th and 14th Air Groups. For months, they had mocked the P-38's cowardly diving tactics, insisting that once they caught the lightning at equal altitude, the fight would always favor the Zero. They believed they held numerical superiority, tactical advantage, and the initiative. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that the 5th Air Force had spent the entire summer planning a blow so devastating it would break Japanese air power in New Guinea forever. Shortly after dawn on 17 August 1943, the first wave of P-38's lifted off from Tsili Tsili, engines kicking dust into swirling clouds as pilots throttled forward. The plan was simple, brutal, and brilliant. Hit WWII when Japanese aircraft were lined up on the ground, fuel trucks still pumping gasoline, pilots just waking in their barracks. The lightnings approached at high altitude, formation tight, contrails thin and ghostly in the cold morning air. Below them, WWII still slept. Then, as if on cue, the lead element rolled over. Dozens of P-38s fell from the sky like silver spears. Their dive angles were so steep that some pilots felt the onset of compressibility rumbling at the edges of the controls. But the technique had been practiced for months. They knew when to ease back, when to feather slightly, how to ride the knife edge of speed without losing control. At nearly 480 to 500 miles per hour, the lightning screamed down on the airfields. The Japanese never saw it coming. The first bursts of .50 caliber fire chewed through parked aircraft like a saw blade. Fuel drums exploded. Hangars burst into flame. Zeros with engines still cold were shredded on the ground. Ground crews ran for cover. Others died where they stood. In a matter of minutes, dozens of Japanese fighters were burning. But the real test came minutes later, when the surviving Japanese pilots scrambled into their aircraft. Engines coughed to life. Zeros streaked into the air, desperate to intercept the American wave before it could withdraw. In the past, this was where they dominated: close-range maneuver, climbing spirals, tight horizontal turns. Not today, not anymore. The P-38s were waiting. The second wave dove from altitude, perfectly timed to intercept the Zeros just as they lifted into the sky. The Japanese pilots, still climbing, still accelerating, could do nothing but watch death fall toward them at 450 miles per hour. Boom, a burst, a lightning shot upward. Zoom. A Zero piloted by a veteran of Rabaul tried to roll into a defensive turn. He barely finished half the maneuver before a pair of P-38s dropped through the clouds and tore his aircraft apart in a single 2-second burst. Another tried to climb vertically, but the P-38s had started from far higher altitude and far greater energy. The Lightning pilots struck, climbed, repositioned, struck again. The Japanese were being attacked from angles they couldn't cover, at speeds they couldn't match, by an enemy they couldn't chase. The air above WWII became a slaughterhouse. Radio chatter crackled with disbelief. Zeros breaking, multiple formations scattered, no cohesion. Targets everywhere, pick them off, don't slow down. Watch your speed, do not level turn, stay vertical. The Japanese pilots, once confident masters of the Pacific, were overwhelmed. Their formations disintegrated within minutes. Some attempted to dive away, but the P-38 simply followed, the one maneuver the Japanese had once believed impossible. The Lightning's dive superiority was absolute. Near 500 miles per hour, the Zero began to shudder. Past 520, it lost structural integrity. A P-38 could hit those speeds effortlessly. It wasn't a chase, it was an execution. By the end of the first WWII strike, over 100 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in the air and on the ground. The Americans lost almost none. That would have been enough to cripple Japanese air power, but they weren't done. On 18 August, they hit WWII again. On 20th August, again. Later in October, again. Each time, P-38 formations descended from high altitude in disciplined, devastating boom and zoom assaults. Each time, Japanese resistance dissolved faster. Each time, more aircraft were destroyed than Japan could replace. Intelligence summaries described the results succinctly. Enemy air strength at WWII has ceased to be a factor. Pilots returning from the missions expressed disbelief at how one tactic, one maneuver the Japanese had laughed at in 1942, had become the blade that gutted their entire air presence. In a diary found at WWII after the Allied advance months later, a Japanese pilot wrote, "The Lightning attacks like a hawk. It descends with impossible speed. We cannot follow, we cannot fight it. When the P-38 appears above us, we scatter like leaves before a storm." The technique was no longer just a tactic, it was the defining characteristic of American air combat in the Southwest Pacific. Altitude as the throne, diving speed as the sword, discipline as the shield. WWII wasn't a battle, it was a statement, a declaration that the era of zero dominance was over and that the twin-engine fighter Japan had mocked in 1942 had become the deadliest machine in the Pacific sky. By early 1944, the P-38 Lightning was no longer the awkward, misunderstood, twin-boomed outsider it had been in 1942. It was now the undisputed king of the Southwest Pacific sky, the preferred weapon of every top ace in 5th Air Force, the spearhead of General George Kenney's air strategy, and the nightmare of every Japanese pilot who glimpsed its silhouette glinting in the sun. The boom and zoom doctrine that had taken shape in 1943 had matured into a lethal science, no longer improvised, no longer experimental, but executed with the cold precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The battles over Hollandia, Aitape, and the northern coast of New Guinea proved it. They did not simply show the P-38's superiority, they revealed a battlefield where Japanese air units barely survived long enough to fight. It began in April 1944 when Allied forces prepared to seize Hollandia and Aitape in one of the boldest amphibious assaults of the Pacific War. To succeed, Kenney needed air supremacy, total, crushing, unquestionable, and he had just the aircraft to deliver it. At dawn on April 3, 1944, dozens of P-38s from the 475th and 8th Fighter Groups lifted off from Nadzab and Sidor, climbing into a brilliant blue sky streaked with high cirrus. Their mission was to sweep ahead of the invasion force and destroy any Japanese aircraft capable of interfering. The Lightning pilots had the same advantage they exploited at WWII: altitude, speed, and the vertical plane of combat. But this time, the Japanese weren't just unprepared, they were desperate. New Guinea's airfields were depleted, fuel was scarce, pilots were exhausted. Many fighter units arriving from Rabaul and Truk were already bloodied before they even reached the front. Yet they still believed the Zero could turn the tide in close combat. They didn't understand that the battle they wanted no longer existed. Shortly after 9, the P-38s approached Hollandia's airfields. Dozens of Japanese fighters, A-6M Zeros, K-43 Oscars, and a handful of K-61 Tonys scrambled to intercept. It was exactly the scenario Japanese pilots believed favored them, climbing in formation, prepared for a swirling, horizontal dogfight. But the Lightnings never descended to that level. From 27,000 feet, the first element rolled into a smooth, deadly dive, sunlight flashing off their wings as they accelerated past 400 miles per hour. The Japanese pilots, still climbing, barely had time to react. The P-38s thundered through their formations like steel meteorites, firing 1-second bursts that tore wings from fuselages and shattered engines. Before the Japanese could turn, the Americans were already climbing away, engines roaring, regaining altitude like giant birds shaking off prey. For every Japanese pilot who tried to follow, the same fate awaited: a trembling airframe, stiffening control surfaces, the onset of aerodynamic lockup, and the terrifying realization that the Lightning was pulling away effortlessly, gaining separation in seconds. Then the second wave hit, then the third. Boom, burst, zoom. The strikes were perfectly sequenced, each group attacking from staggered altitudes, each dive executed with precision drilled over months of combat. Below, Hollandia's airfields erupted in flame. Dozens of aircraft were caught refueling or taxiing. Fuel trucks exploded, ammunition dumps ignited in towering columns of smoke. Ground crews ran for cover behind revetments that offered no real protection from high-velocity .50 caliber rounds. Radio chatter between P-38 elements was calm, almost dispassionate. 2 enemy fighters destroyed, climbing. Multiple bandits scattering. Ignore turners, stay vertical. Tony on your 6, breaking off, he can't hold speed. The Japanese pilots, realizing the futility of chasing the Lightnings upward, tried to lure them into a horizontal combat. They rolled, turned, looped desperately, hoping to pull the Americans down into a circle fight. But the Lightnings no longer took the bait. They held altitude, they climbed, they repositioned, they hit again. In a diary later recovered at Hollandia, a Japanese pilot wrote, "Lightning does not fight. Lightning strikes. We see them only when we are already dead." By midday, resistance had collapsed. The sky above Hollandia belonged entirely to the Americans.
More than 60 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in a single day. The Japanese lost so many experienced pilots that several squadrons were disbanded by mid-April. In the P-38's, they returned home with almost no losses. The same pattern repeated over Itape, Wakti, Sarmi, and the approaches to Biak. Every time Japanese fighters rose to challenge the invasion force, the Lightning swept them aside with the same merciless efficiency. It wasn't simply that the Lightning was faster, it was that the Americans had mastered the vertical fight so completely that the Japanese no longer understood what battle they were in. By summer 1944, intelligence officers reported that Japanese units were avoiding combat with P-38 formations if altitude disadvantage existed. Translated, if the P-38's were above them, the Japanese didn't even try. They scattered, they dove for clouds, they hugged the treetops. The era of zero dominance was not just over, it had reversed. The hunter had become the hunted, and the P-38 had become the symbol of American air supremacy in the Southwest Pacific. In one combat debrief, a young P-38 pilot summed up the entire transformation in a single sentence. They laughed at our dives in 42, they ran from them in 44. But the final proof, the moment Japanese pilots realized they could no longer survive the vertical battlefield, would come only months later in the skies of the Philippines, where the Lightning would complete the destruction of Japan's veteran Air Corps.
By the time American forces surged into the Philippines in late 1944, the P-38 Lightning was no longer just a fighter. It was a method, a doctrine, a sharpened instrument of aerial dominance that had rewritten the playbook of the Pacific War. The Zero, once the terror of the sky, was now a relic of an older style of combat, light, agile, deadly at low speeds, but catastrophically fragile in the face of vertical maneuvering, high-speed dives, and coordinated slashing attacks. Japan kept trying to fight the War of 1942. The United States had already jumped ahead to 1945. The difference was fatal. When the 49th Fighter Group and 475th Fighter Group began operations over Leyte, Mindoro, and Luzon, they encountered a Japanese Air Force already weakened by New Guinea and Hollandia, but still determined to resist. The Japanese committed A-6M Zeros, Ki-43 Hoskers, Ki-44 Tojos, and even the faster Ki-84 Frank in desperate attempts to blunt the American advance. They sent everything they had, and it didn't matter. The P-38 pilots had perfected boom and zoom into an art form. At 25,000 feet, Lightnings orbited silently, waiting for the Japanese to rise. They always did. And the outcome was always the same. On 7 December 1944, nearly 2 years after the attack on Pearl Harbor, a formation of P-38's escorting bombers over Ormoc Bay spotted more than 20 Zeros climbing in a loose spiral. In 1942, this would have been a deadly threat. In 1944, it was an opportunity. The lead P-38 element rolled over and dove, then the next, then the next. The sky became a series of vertical strikes, silver arrows falling from the heavens, firing 1-second bursts that ripped apart anything caught in their path. Zero tried to roll away, but stalled under the sudden high-speed pressure. Another attempted a climbing turn, only to be cut down by a Lightning screaming past at nearly 480 miles per hour. For every Japanese fighter climbing, there were 2 P-38's diving. For every evasive turn, the Americans had altitude to burn. The Japanese pilots realized, too late, that they were fighting ghosts, an enemy that appeared from above, killed instantly, and vanished before they could even level their wings. After the battle, 5th Air Force Intelligence issued a blunt summary. Japanese fighter units are no longer capable of resisting P-38 formations at any altitude. Over the next months, the same pattern repeated across Mindoro, Lingayen Gulf, Manila, and the mountainous regions of northern Luzon. Whenever Japanese aircraft tried to intercept bombers or strafing runs, the Lightning swept in from above using pure speed to dictate the fight. The Zero's once feared maneuverability meant nothing when its opponents refused to turn. In January 1945, during a major engagement near Luzon, ace pilot Thomas McGuire led a flight of P-38's into a layered vertical engagement that demonstrated exactly how the Americans now fought. While Japanese fighters attempted to form defensive Lufberry circles, McGuire's flight attacked from staggered altitudes, one wave diving, another climbing, another repositioning. It was a three-dimensional battlefield Japan had never trained for. The Zero pilots fought bravely, but blindly, trying to bring their aircraft into tight horizontal maneuvers, while the Americans struck from vectors they couldn't track. "The enemy is everywhere," one Japanese pilot radioed before his signal cut off. He was right. The Americans were everywhere, above, behind, below, striking and climbing before the Japanese could react. Even when Japan deployed newer aircraft like the P-84 Frank, capable of better climb rates and higher speed, the Lightning held its advantage: energy dominance. The P-38 could keep its speed through dives, zoom climbs, and slashing attacks in ways the Japanese airframes simply weren't engineered to match. The Frank was dangerous in a turning fight, but the Americans never gave it one. Boom and zoom erased every advantage Japan might have had. By mid-1945, over Borneo and Formosa, Japanese air resistance had dwindled to scattered flights, brave but hopeless. Many Japanese pilots were rushed into service with only hours of training, believing the Zero's legacy could save them. It couldn't. Their aircraft shattered under high-speed dive pressure. Their formations fell apart under vertical attacks. Their radios malfunctioned or lacked range, and they faced P-38 pilots who had spent 2 years perfecting one single lethal concept: speed kills. The final demonstration came in April 1945 when P-38s escorting heavy bombers near Formosa dove onto a formation of Oscars attempting to intercept. The attack lasted less than 2 minutes. 7 enemy aircraft fell burning into the sea. Not a single P-38 was hit. In the post-war analysis, Japanese officers admitted the truth: we were never able to counter the Lightning's dive attack. We could not pursue. We could not escape. The P-38 controlled the sky. The Japanese pilots who once mocked the Lightning's dive speed never understood what they were fighting. An aircraft that fought in a different dimension, one their machines and doctrines were never designed to survive. The war ended not because the Zero failed, but because the P-38 rewrote the rules. It proved that altitude was power, speed was survival, and a well-executed boom and zoom strike was deadlier than any turn fight ever fought in the Pacific. In the end, the Lightning didn't outturn the Zero. It didn't need to. It simply dove, struck, and climbed away.